Hello everyone, welcome to Chetan Bharat Learning and welcome back to our course called UPSC Mains 2021. This is a course and a test series. Alright, now this course is designed for all those people who have qualified their prelims and are appearing for their mains. And all those people who weren't able to qualify their prelims but still want to prepare for mains for next year, well, they are welcome to join this course as well. Now at the outset, let me tell you that many people in the comment section are typing that where can they find the PDF for this lecture or how can they join this course? Well, you have to do nothing, just call on the number given in the description section or on the ticker just below the screen. Right? Just call on this number, contact us and we'll guide you through the entire process. Alright, now till now there are two lectures with respect to economics that have been covered. As you all know, those of you who have joined this course, they know this, that we have given you this timetable, right? So according to this timetable, today is 27th of October and today we'll be discussing 5 questions. And in this series, the economy portion is number 3. Alright, so today we are going to discuss 5 questions from which topic? Well, topic is called Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. Since this topic is a heavy topic, it's a big topic, that's why we have dedicated 3 classes, 15 questions to be precise, to this particular topic. Alright, now the previous 2 lectures were also dedicated to this particular topic. Now, through these 5 questions, what we are trying to do is covering as many issues as possible that can be important for your mains examination. Now, my job over here is to teach you economics related portion. Now, economics, as you guys all know, is part of GS3. And our aim over here is to cover as many issues as possible from GS3. So that we are hoping that one of the questions that we are going to discuss in our lectures might come in your mains as well. Even if that is not the case, well, the issues that we are going to discuss in these lectures, there is a strong chance that some of those issues might come in your mains examination. All right. Now, enough of the introduction. Let's start with question number 1. Well, question number 1 is related to Nobel Prize that has been awarded this year. It's a current affairs topic and there is every chance that UPSC might ask you a question related to this particular topic. Well, let's read the question first because reading the question is half your job. Half the battle is won when you read the question carefully. All right, so let's read the question carefully. Question number 1. This year's Swearengen's Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel was awarded to 3 US-based economists. Explain the contribution for which this prize was awarded. Comment on the relevance of this contribution for India. Well, it's a current affairs based question, but nonetheless it's very important for your economics. So let's take a look at this. Well, as a matter of fact, this particular prize is also known as Nobel for Economics. Now, in the introduction part, you'll explain which people who has received this prize for this year and what was their contribution, right? That should be the part that should form the part of your introduction. So in the introduction, you'll write that this year's Nobel Prize for Economics was given to 3 people, 3 US-based economists, as it has been mentioned in the question. All right. Now you need to be familiar with the name of those people, right? So, the prize was given to 3 people, let me tell you. One was David Card. He was from University of California. The other person was Joshua D. Angrist. I'm sorry. Angrist. Well, he was from the very famous MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the third person was Guido Imbens. Well, these 3 people received the Nobel Prize for Economics this year. Now, the prize was shared by these 3 people. One half of the prize went to David Card and the other half of the prize went to these 2 people. All right. Yeah, by the way, Guido Imbens was from Stanford. Now, knowing the names of these people is important, but it's not the main part of your answer. It's like cherry on the top of the cake. right? The main marks that you'll get, from answering this question would come from if you answer why these people got this prize, right? What was their contribution? Because in the question itself, they have categorically asked you, explain the contribution for which this prize was awarded, right? So let's take a look at what was their contribution. What was the contribution of these three people? Now, before understanding the contribution of these three people, you need to know a bit about economics. Well, you see, economics is considered a part of social sciences. As you guys all know, well, there are two types of sciences, social sciences and natural sciences. Well, in natural sciences, there are subjects like physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, and in social sciences, there are subjects like psychology, economics for that matter, right? So economics is part of this group. Yet, sometimes, economics is treated as a subject of natural sciences. How? Well, in economics, there are certain questions we ask. Right? So, like we ask this question, what would happen if government increases the minimum wage? Would it increase employment or decrease employment levels? Right? There is this question that is asked regularly. If we increase employment, then if we increase minimum wage, would employment increase or decrease? Or sometimes we ask, if RBI increases repo rate, what impact it would have on the inflation levels, right? There are certain questions that we need to answer. Now, in natural sciences, in physics, chemistry, mathematics, biology, you can answer certain questions by experimentation. You can answer certain questions by conducting an experiment, and that experiment would yield results, and based on those results, you can draw your own conclusions. In subjects of natural sciences, creating lab-like conditions for experiments is very easy. But that's not the case with subjects like economics. In economics, creating a lab-like situation is very difficult because economics deals with people. You can't treat people as lab rats, right? So in economics, answering empirical questions is very difficult because you can't create lab-like situations, right? But nonetheless, we actually conduct surveys in economics. Nonetheless, we do have data on the basis of which we draw conclusions. Now, there are a few things that you need to know. Well, let's suppose you need to answer this question. Would increase in minimum wages decrease employment or increase employment? Now, logically speaking, they say, those economists who study economics, well, they say that if you increase minimum wages, it would create a sort of burden on the employers. It would create a sort of burden on the factory owners, right? So their labor cost would increase. And when their labor cost would increase, to minimize their labor cost, they would fire certain laborers. They would remove those laborers from their jobs. That would happen. So if you increase minimum wage, then employment levels would fall, or as you can say, unemployment levels would rise. Now that's a logical conclusion based on certain assumptions, right? You are assuming the behavior of factory owners. All right. Now, for this to be a fact, for this logical conclusion to be a fact, this fact needs to be backed by data. Now, where do economists get their data? Well, they get their data from surveys, right? So let's suppose to answer this question, economists conducted a survey. They analyzed the particular area, they analyzed the particular district or a state for 5 years. And in those 5 years, they found that whenever minimum wages were increased, let's suppose they're talking about Haryana. So they are surveying Haryana, they are actually observing Haryana for 5 years, and they saw that when in Haryana they increased minimum wages, employment levels fell. Now, from the perspective of data, this is event 1, increase in minimum wages, and this is event 2, decrease in employment. Now, students of statistics know this, that when event 1 happens and event 2 happens, and both of them are happening simultaneously, then there is a correlation. there is a correlation between them. Correlation means that event 1 and event 2 are happening simultaneously. Chances of event 1 and event 2 happening simultaneously are more if correlation is strong. That's what they say. That's what statisticians say. Now, generally in economics, we go by this correlation only. When we find that there is correlation between increase in minimum wages and decline in unemployment, a decline in employment, we say that decline in unemployment, the reason for decline in unemployment is increase in minimum wages. Because there is strong correlation between these two events, we say that the reason for falling employment levels is increase in minimum wages. But there is a catch and there is a problem. And what is that problem? The problem is that increase in minimum wages does not necessarily mean that there would be decrease in employment. Or let me rephrase this. Increase in minimum wages is not the cause behind falling employment levels. Employment level can fall because of variety of reasons. There might be many other reasons that were happening in Haryana in those 5 years that decreased employment. Maybe employment levels fell not because of increase in minimum wages, but because of change in behavior of employers. Maybe because of improvement in technology. Maybe because of improvement in access to automation, that many factory owners are automating their machines and they're firing workers. There are so many reasons for employment levels to fall. How can we clearly say that just because these two events have a strong correlation, minimum wages is the cause behind employment? To establish cause, well, the word for it is causality. Right? The word for it is causality. So the thing is, it's easy to establish a correlation between event 1 and event 2. You don't have to do anything. You just have to gather data. You have to monitor the employment levels for 5 years in Haryana. You have to monitor the minimum wage levels in Haryana for 5 years. And when there is a strong correlation, you say, well, event 1 is the cause behind event 2. That's the assumption. But that's not the truth. There is correlation, but there is no causality. And to establish causality is very difficult in economics because you can't create lab-like conditions as you can create in natural sciences, right? In natural sciences, it's not just the correlation part that is easy. Establishing causality is also easy. You can test certain things. For example, in medicine, they conduct randomized control trials, whether this particular vaccine is working or not, whether this particular medicine is working or not, whether the use of this particular vaccine is decreasing the disease levels. That is what causality is. It's easy to establish causality in randomized control trials in medicine, but it's very difficult to create lab-like conditions or experiments in social sciences and economics. So the best we can do is gather data on correlation, but it's difficult to establish causality. Well, till now it was difficult to establish causality because David Card and others actually tried to establish causality between the correlating events. Their research was actually in this area. They developed certain methodologies. These people developed certain methodologies which can be employed in the field of economics, through which you can also test for causality. You don't have to be satisfied just with correlation. You can also apply their methodologies and test for causality. And this is kind of a revolution for economics because till now we just relied on correlation. This event is happening, this event is happening. Maybe this event is the cause behind this event. Maybe. But in economics, we found that to be gospel truth. Till now, because we had no other way out to establish causality. We could only test for correlation. Make sense? But now after the research of David Card, Angrist and Imbens, we can now establish for causality. We can now test for causality as well. So they got Nobel Prize because of this. These three people actually developed certain methodologies to test for causality, right? Which is very difficult in economics. But that was their contribution. And hence the Nobel Prize for these three. Well, David Card was actually analyzing this particular question only. The research of David Card's research was actually on this topic. Whether increase in minimum wages, what sort of impact would minimum wages have on employment levels. That was the precise question on which David Card was researching on, right? And do you know what David Card found? David Card found that you cannot say for sure that increase in minimum wages is the cause behind decline in employment levels. So till now, the conventional wisdom in the field of economics was, that please don't increase minimum wages because that would be detrimental for employment levels in your country. And that's what India followed also. India has been following this logic only. But last year, David Card, through his research on minimum wages and employment, proved that causality between these two events is not non-establishable. It cannot be established. Yes, there might be some correlation, but there is no causality. And it's kind of a revelation because till now people believe that minimum wages, increase in minimum wages would have a detrimental impact on employment levels. But David Card proved that it's not the case. There is no causality between these two events, right? Now, what was the contribution of these two people? Well, these two people were also working on causality and correlation, but they were working on a different question. While David Card worked on this particular question, you know, Imbens and Angrist worked on which question? Well, they worked on this question. Well, they worked on whether increasing 1 year of compulsory education would increase employment levels. Generally, we say that, like for example, in India, up to 14 years of age, every child has a right to free and compulsory education, right? Till 14 years, you are compulsorily required to educate yourself, right? Free and fair, free and compulsory education till the age of 14. Now, people ask that if we increase this age to 15, if we increase compulsory education by 1 year, would that make people more skillful? Would that improve the skill level of the workers in your country? And would that make them more employable? Or, let me rephrase this, what impact would 1 year of increase in education have on employability of workers? If we increase the compulsory education of students by 1 year, what impact it would have on the skill level of the people and employability of the people, right? They actually were working on this question. So David Card worked on this question, and these people worked on the skill, the role of education vis-a-vis employment. Make sense? And again, all three of them were trying to establish causality instead of correlation, because correlation is half-truth. And as they say, half-truth is sometimes worse than a lie. Maybe it's not revealing the complete picture, right? So establishing causality in economics would take economics closer to the domain of natural sciences rather than being in social sciences. And that is very important. Now, the second part of your question was, explain the contribution for which the prize was awarded. This was the first part. Second part was, comment on the relevance of contribution for India. How this particular research is relevant for India. Well, in India's case, what happened? Let me give you an example, or let me narrate to you a story, all right? Well, in 2020, COVID-19 pandemic hit India, right? It actually reached India's shores. And in response to that, government actually enforced a brutal, stringent lockdown, right? Now, by brutal or stringent, I actually mean that it was required. I'm not saying that in a pejorative sense. Well, it was the requirement of the time, all right? So government actually enforced a lockdown. And because of that lockdown, Indian economy went through a phase of recession. Now, what's the impact of recession on the employment levels? Well, naturally, everyone knows this, that when there is a recession, there is demand for goods, there is a decline in the demand for goods and services. And when there is a decline in the demand for goods and services, well, factories are shut down and workers are like fired from their jobs, right? So when there is a recession, there is increase in unemployment levels. So India was facing a heavy crisis of unemployment, especially through lockdown. And even after lockdown, employment levels did not increase. India was facing a severe crisis of unemployment. Now, what did India do? Well, as you know, that labor is a concurrent subject. That means both center and states can enact laws on labor, right? Now, as you guys all know, that labor laws in our country actually also regulate minimum wages. Now, what did Indian establishment do? What did Indian government do? Well, they knew they were also relying on that conventional wisdom in economics. They were also relying on the fact, the logic, that increase in minimum wages causes decline in employment levels. And vice versa. If you decrease minimum wage, maybe employment levels would rise. That's what Indian government believed, right? Now, Indian government was facing this crisis of unemployment. So Indian government thought that what we should do. What should we do? Well, we should decrease or make minimum wage legislations a bit more relaxed. What Indian government did was, not the Indian government, but many states in India. What did many states in India do? Well, many states in India actually relaxed the norms for minimum wages. So now in those states like UP, Haryana, right? In those states, employers were not bound by providing their workers with a minimum wage. The idea was that decline in minimum wage would increase employment levels, and hence we would be out of this crisis. They were relying on the conventional wisdom in which we believe that decline in minimum wages increases employment. So to solve the problem of unemployment, many states in India, UP, Haryana, they relaxed minimum wage regulations. And when they relaxed that, well, they were hoping that employers would now hire more workers, demand for work would increase, and employment crisis would get solved. Right? That was their idea. And that's what they did. But many economists at that time were also researching. Many economists in India were actually studying the work of David Card. They were studying the work of David Card. And they warned the governments, they warned these state governments to not relax minimum wages, because they said that on the basis of the research of David Card, there is no causality between minimum wage and employment. So maybe these state governments are relaxing minimum wages, but that wouldn't have any significant impact on employment levels. You should not relax minimum wages because they won't have any impact on employment levels. Now, what was the basis on which they gave this assertion? Well, they gave this assertion on the basis of the research conducted by David Card. Now, how significant is this for India? Well, in India also, various policy makers come out with various economic policies. Now, if those economic policies are not backed by data, they are not backed by proper research, well, those economic policies, no matter how good they are, those economic policies would backfire. As we say in good governance, we say that informed policy making is the need of the hour. Informed policy making is very important. Well, in economics, informed policy making is actually suffering from a disability. And what is that disability? Till now, we could only establish correlation, not causality. But after the work of David Card, Angrist, and Imbens, we can now establish causality as well. And now our policy decisions would be based on more data, more research, and they would be considered, they would fall in the category of informed policy making. So our policy analysis, our policy prescriptions would improve because now we can establish causality between different events. Does that make any sense? So that was the reason why these people were awarded the Nobel Prize. Now, I have explained the entire issue to you guys. I have explained the entire issue. Well, how you should structure your answer? Well, you will see that in the model answers that we are going to provide in the PDF right next to this lecture. All right. By the way, I'm hoping that you understand this issue now. I have explained this issue in pretty detailed fashion. All right. So now you know, explain the contribution for which this prize was awarded. Now you know the significance or relevance for this contribution to India. All right. Make sense? Now let's move on to the next question. Question number 2. One of the biggest federal dispute between center and states recently was related to GST compensation. What was the dispute and how was it resolved? So first part of your question is pretty easy. What was the dispute with respect to GST compensation? You can easily explain that if you know the answer. And how was it resolved? What was the solution that was offered by the center to the states? Or how did center and states resolve this issue, right? So it's a fairly direct question. They have directly asked you what was the GST compensation issue and how was it resolved. Now the tricky part of this question is the second part of this question. And what's this second part? What can be done to avoid such disputes in future? Now, let me explain to you the issue. Only then you will be able to answer this question. Well, in this question, you don't have to be worried about the introduction part, how you should introduce your answer, what sort of introduction you should start with, right? You shouldn't be worried about the introduction part because they have categorically asked you what was the dispute. So you can start with this. You can start your answer by answering this question itself. Don't worry about the introduction part. You know, as they say, I'm just digressing a bit. Many people advise you when you're appearing for mains. In UPSC, as they say, that UPSC is a national level exam, right? So there are many people to advise you. And sometimes many people give you wrong advices, right? So you should be selective in your, you should be selective in your approach towards taking advice, all right? Now, be that as it may, let me tell you, you shouldn't be worried about the introduction for this question, and don't worry about that I should always start my answer with a quotation. Don't worry about these things. Introduction should always have a quotation and all that stuff. No, there's no need for that. There are no extra marks for that. Let me be categorical. Now, let's return back to this question. Okay, what was the dispute? Let me explain to you the dispute. Well, you know that GST in India, for GST to come in India, there was a requirement of constitutional amendment. So through 101st Constitutional Amendment Act, GST was enacted in India. GST became a part of your indirect taxation regime. Now this was a sort of constitutional amendment which also required ratification of 50% states. This was that sort of a amendment, right? As you all know, if you have studied polity, that there are three types of amendments: simple majority, special majority, and the third is special majority plus ratification of states. Well, this was one of those amendments that required ratification of states as well. So that means you had to take states on board. You had to form a consensus with states as well, right? So to attract states, what did the center offer? Well, this BJP government offered states this option. They said that let's do one thing. Let's put majority or almost 90% of center plus state taxes in GST. And we'll divide GST into two parts, CGST and SGST. Now CGST, the money accrued through CGST would go to center, and the money accrued through SGST would go to states. Now states were given this offer, but states did not agree to this offer. What did the states say? States say that we have two issues with this. Issue number one, if we become a part of GST regime, our power of taxation is lost. How is our power of taxation lost? Well, earlier, when we had control over state taxes, it was our choice to decide on the rates of those taxations. For example, Punjab had the power to decide the rates for VAT, sales tax in Punjab. Haryana had the power to decide for VAT, excise duty, sales tax in Haryana, right? We will lose that power, and that power will be given to GST Council. So in a sense, individual states are losing their power of taxation. Okay. The other part was loss of revenue. So one concern was with respect to sovereignty, tax sovereignty, and the other concern was loss of revenue. States were arguing that under SGST or under GST, they won't get that much revenue as they would have gotten had they persisted with their own taxation regime. That was their idea. Well, center said that power of taxation is not completely lost. Now, what was the center's answer to these two points of dispute? Center said that your power of taxation is not completely lost. You are losing some power of your taxation, and we are also losing some power of taxation. You and I, all of us, center and states, are giving this power to GST Council. And well, GST Council, what is GST Council? GST Council is also made up of center and states. Members of GST Council are representatives of state governments only. And central government representatives are also there. So we are not actually snatching power away from you. We are pooling together our power. So in a sense, your power, your exclusive power of taxation is only partly lost. You will get that power back by becoming a member of GST Council. Right? Okay. Now this part was a tricky one. Center agreed, yes, there might be some loss to your revenue. So what did Center offer? Center said, all right, let's do one thing. Let's assume that had GST not been enacted, if there was no GST, your revenue from state taxes increased every year by 14%. Let's assume that. Let me clear the board for this. Let's assume that every year your revenue increased by 14%. Let's make this assumption. Now, this is old regime. Now, under the new GST regime, in case there is a shortfall, let's suppose under the old regime you would have earned 100 rupees and under the new GST regime you are earning 70 rupees. So you are facing a shortfall of 30 rupees. Well, Center said that we will give you this 30 rupees. We will provide you with this shortfall for next 5 years. That's it, not more than that. For next 5 years, in case there is a shortfall between your new GST revenues and those revenues that you would have earned had there been no GST. Well, we will compensate for that shortfall for next 5 years. Now, how would Center get money to provide states with this shortfall? Well, Center would levy a cess called compensation cess. Center would levy a compensation cess on sin goods, sin and luxury goods, like tobacco or there are various sin goods, various sin goods and luxury goods. We will apply a compensation cess on this. The money collected through compensation cess would go to compensation fund. And whenever there is a shortfall, we will provide you with the compensation through this fund. That was the entire regime for next 5 years. Now, these 5 years were about to expire in June 2022. All right. Now, what happened? Well, Corona happened. Yes, Corona happened. What happened in Corona? Lockdown, recession. And what happened in recession? Well, GST revenues declined considerably because there was no trade, because there was lockdown. So though there were little amount of goods and services that were being traded. Hence, GST revenues fell. And GST revenues fell. It's but natural that SGST, state GST revenues also fell. So in a sense, shortfall increased during this time, because SGST revenues fell, right? So shortfall would have increased. But the problem is that because there was little GST that was collected, compensation cess also fell. Which means Center had little money in the compensation fund to compensate to states for their shortfall. So shortfall increased and compensation fund decreased. Now Center was in no position to compensate states, whereas states were asking that their revenues fell, and as per your promise during the GST enactment, as per your promise, we should be compensated for this shortfall. But we are not being compensated for this shortfall. Why? Well, Center's argument was we have not collected enough money in our compensation fund. But states said that we don't care. You made a promise, fulfill that promise. You made a promise. We don't care how you get us the money. You fulfill that promise. Well, center's argument was that, look, COVID-19 related lockdown was not actually what do you say? Was not we didn't have the foresight to see that such a crisis could happen in future. We didn't know that, right? And because we didn't know, well, we couldn't make arrangements for that back when we enacted GST. So we didn't know a crisis like COVID-19 would hit India. And therefore, we didn't make any plannings, we didn't make any arrangements for that. And because of this, well, we say that this particular shortfall is an act of God. And we are not obligated to compensate you for that. So center said we are not obligated because when we made that promise, we didn't know that such a crisis would come. Whereas state said, well, you made a promise, fulfill it at any cost. So there was this federal dispute. And now the first part of your question is answered. What was the dispute? Now let's come to how this dispute was resolved. Well, center said that, look, we don't have the money to give you, but we can offer you a solution. You can borrow money. And we're giving you two options. There are two borrowing windows open for you. One, under RBI, you can directly borrow money from RBI, and your debt, the interest on your debt, shall be paid off by compensation cess only. So compensation cess was about to expire or was scheduled to expire on June 2022. But center said that we would continue with compensation cess, only this time compensation cess would be levied to fulfill the debt obligations of states who borrowed under this window. Right? So states were given the option to borrow from RBI, and their borrowings would be paid off through compensation cess continuing even beyond June 2022. Right? The other window was borrow from market, and we are not obligated to fulfill your debt obligations through compensation cess. Right? So naturally states opted for this option. They had no other choice because center said no categorically. So this dispute was resolved by giving states the option to borrow from these two windows. That's it. Now the tricky part of the question comes. And what's that tricky part? Well, what can be done to avoid such disputes in future? What can be done? Well, number one, what should you write? Let me explain this in detail. Way forward. More coordination between center and states in GST Council, so that even if such a dispute or a dispute like this appears in future, well, you are fully equipped to resolve that dispute. And disputes, federal disputes with respect to taxation can only be resolved if center and states are cooperating well under GST Council. Right? The other part is states should be made more financially viable so that they are not dependent upon center for certain funds, right? Currently, they are dependent upon center for various grants and various other things, various compensations, right? So the only answer is that states should be made more financially independent so they are not dependent upon center, and disputes like these do not arise in future, right? The other both center and state should cooperate to allow India to come back to a recovery path. That's very important because these disputes arise only during the times of crisis. right? When there is no crisis, well, money is overflowing and there is no dispute at all because everyone has money. Only when the money dries up that center and states fight for resources. So make sure that your economy is growing properly. It's on a proper recovery path. Hence, in future, you don't have money problems and therefore taxation problems won't arise. So your answer should revolve around these three things only. You can expand on these 3 points and you should conclude your answer. All right? Make sense? So yeah, question number 3. Rather than offloading the entire fiscal stimulus, it's a very tricky question. It's a very important one also. Rather than offloading the entire fiscal stimulus in the beginning of the pandemic, India followed a calibrated approach in its fiscal response. Do you think it was a better approach given India's economic situation? If yes, then give reasons for your answer. Now let me explain, because I think many people are finding it difficult to understand this question, right? Many people might find it difficult to understand this question. So let me explain the question to you. You see, when India was facing a recession-like situation during the lockdown, during the initial days of the lockdown, many people, many economists in India advised Indian government to follow the approach that was employed by the West. Many Western countries offloaded their fiscal stimulus. They expanded their fiscal deficit like anything. Like immediately, they expanded their fiscal deficit immediately. During the initial days of the lockdown, they expanded their fiscal deficit. Now, many economists said that to save India's economy, India should also follow this approach. They should increase their fiscal deficit immediately, offload their fiscal stimulus package. But how did India approach this question, this quagmire? Well, what India did was, India did not immediately increase fiscal deficit. India did not immediately provided fiscal stimulus. India did not immediately offloaded its fiscal stimulus. India actually followed a calibrated approach. And what do I mean by calibrated approach? During the initial days, India provided a small fiscal stimulus. Then when the lockdown passed and there was unlocking, India increased its fiscal stimulus. And eventually, by the time it was November and December of 2020, India increased its fiscal stimulus more. So initially, India did not increase its fiscal stimulus. It provided only certain amount of relief measures. Then it increased its fiscal stimulus and then it dramatically expanded its fiscal stimulus through Atmanirbhar Bharat package and all. Right? Now, why did India follow this approach? Well, you have to agree with this. They are asking you if yes, well, you have to say yes, and then you have to give your reasons. Now, what were the reasons? Why did India follow this approach? This question is right from Economic Survey. Economic Survey actually presented an argument that India's approach, calibrated, slow and steady offloading of fiscal stimulus, calibrated approach towards delivering fiscal stimulus, India's approach was better and more suited to India's situation. Now, why was that? Well, let me tell you. During the initial days of the lockdown, supply chains were disrupted. Right? There was no demand in the economy and supply side bottlenecks were high. So during lockdown, people weren't able to buy goods and services. There was little demand and there was little supply also because supply chains, transport was disrupted, right? Now, Western economies, what they did was to revive demand, they increased fiscal deficit. What did India do? India knew that increasing fiscal deficit now won't revive demand. Why? Because even if there is high demand, that demand won't be able to, that demand won't be met because there are supply chain disruptions. Even if you hand out money to people, even if you give people the money, right? They won't be able to buy different goods and services. They won't be able to visit malls. They won't be able to visit hotels because hotels, malls are closed down. So how can you revive demand if there is no, there is nothing in the market to address the demand to, right? Makes sense? So India said that at this very moment, people are suffering, no doubt. But this is not the time to revive demand. This is the time to provide relief. So India came up with Garib Kalyan package. India provided food security. So India's expenditure or fiscal stimulus was more focused on providing food, medicine, hospital beds, and all that. Essential things. So during the initial days of the lockdown, India's fiscal stimulus was little because India knew that at this point, there is no point in reviving demand because that demand needs an outlet. I have so much money, but what can I buy if there are no malls? There are no hotels. I can't spend it. I can't, there is no channel for my demand to go to. Make sense? So there is no point in reviving demand now because nothing is open. At this moment, just give people what they want. They want medicine, they want masks, they want hospital beds, they want food, right? So fiscal stimulus, little fiscal stimulus was focused on this area. Once the unlocking phase started, then India knew that now malls are open, transportation is open, many other things are opening up. Now let's revive demand, now increase our fiscal stimulus. What did the West do? Western countries, USA, UK, provided massive fiscal stimulus during these initial days also. Well, the reason for that is their supply chains were not disrupted that much. But India had weak supply chains and they got disrupted. So therefore, there was no avenue for demand to manifest itself, right? So when unlocking phase started, then India provided demand side fiscal stimulus. India came up with Atmanirbhar Bharat package. India came up with various Diwali bonus schemes for government employees. You remember that part, right? So India followed a calibrated approach. Little stimulus in the initial days, massive stimulus afterwards. Did this approach work well for India? Absolutely, it did. And that's the argument presented by Economic Survey. Now, how you should write this answer, what should be the structure of your answer, what should be the introduction, main body, conclusion, well, you'll get that in the model answers that will be provided to you in the PDF along with this lecture. But my point over here is to explain the issue to you, right? Model answers you can check out and you'll know, you'll absolutely understand how you should write your answer, what sort of arguments, what sort of words you should use, what sort of phrases, sentences you should use. But right now, my job in this particular lecture is just to make you familiar with the issue at hand and to tell you how you should interpret the questions. This question was difficult to interpret, right? But now I hope things are becoming easy for you. All right? Okay then, let's move on to question number 4. It's also it's a bit simpler question. Nonetheless, margin of error is still high. So therefore, let's read the question carefully. India is facing a high inflation risk despite economic recovery being on shaky grounds. This is the current situation. Explain the conundrum being faced by RBI and MPC. By MPC, I mean Monetary Policy Committee. In this situation. Also suggest a way forward. Well, the first step to write answers in mains is to read the question carefully and to understand the question carefully. Now let's understand this question. The statement is that currently there is high risk of inflation, right? And economy is also recovering, but economic growth or economic recovery is still on shaky grounds. It's still not as proper as we would have expected. Economic recovery is still running a risk. Or I should say more vulnerable. Right? So we are currently in a situation when inflation levels are high and side by side economic recovery is also not proper. Now, explain the conundrum that is being faced by RBI and MPC. Now, let me explain to you the conundrum or the difficult situation in which RBI finds itself. Well, whenever there is high inflation, RBI is prescribed, RBI or MPC is prescribed this thing. We call it loose money policy, or we call it monetary expansion, or technically we use the word accommodative monetary policy. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it's actually the opposite. So whenever there is high inflation, RBI is asked to follow a tight money policy. Now, what do I mean by tight money policy? RBI should reduce money supply. So whenever there is high inflation, RBI is prescribed to reduce money supply. So RBI's monetary policy is tight. Now, how does RBI ensure tight money policy? Well, they increase repo rate, which is also known as policy rate. They increase repo rate, they reduce open market operations, or they start selling government bonds. The idea behind RBI's policy is to reduce money supply, because by reducing money supply, inflation would come down. So during high inflation times, RBI increases repo rate, which is part of its tight monetary policy. Under tight monetary policy, RBI increases repo rate. Again, the idea is that reduction in money supply would cause inflation to decline. But when economic growth is low, RBI is asked to follow accommodative monetary policy. And what is in this accommodative monetary policy? Well, RBI is asked to reduce repo rates. Okay, so when inflation is high, RBI is asked to increase repo rate. When economic growth is low and RBI wants to increase economic growth, RBI is asked to reduce repo rate. But what is the situation now? Well, now inflation is also high. Recovery is also on shaky grounds. So what should RBI do? Should RBI target growth and keep repo rates low? Or should RBI be concerned about inflation and increase repo rate? What should RBI do? Don't you think RBI is in this situation of conundrum? RBI is facing this conundrum. What should it do? Should it focus more on growth aspect, or should it focus more on inflation aspect? You don't know. Right? And the recent Monetary Policy Committee meetings are also, their meetings or the minutes of their meetings are also manifesting this problem, are also revealing this problem, that many members of the Monetary Policy Committee are finding it difficult to keep interest rates low, repo rates low, because inflation is high. Yet, if they increase repo rate, then economic growth would suffer. What should it do? So this is the conundrum that RBI and MPC are facing. So now I have explained the first part of this question, right? Now, what sort of words you should use, what sort of introduction you should use, what sort of main body you should use, well, you will find that in model answer. But the issue at hand, I'm sure you understood this, right? So this is the conundrum that RBI is facing. Now, suggest a way forward. Well, the way forward should be neutral. Currently, because economic growth is on shaky grounds, RBI should continue with its accommodative monetary stance. Because growth is more important, economic recovery is more important than inflation. So RBI, I'm answering this part of the question, RBI should continue with accommodative monetary policy. Okay, it should support growth. It should continue to support growth. But what should it do on the in front of inflation? Well, recently RBI advised government to follow certain steps so that inflation can come down. So what is the way forward according to you? Well, RBI should continue with its accommodative monetary policy stance, because economic recovery is still on shaky grounds and it needs to support. Monetary policy needs to support economic recovery. Hence, RBI stance should be accommodative. Now, for inflation, government's fiscal policy should pitch in. Government should handle inflation right? RBI should focus, though RBI should focus on inflation, but currently the situation is such that RBI should focus more on growth. Now, inflation can be reined in, inflation can be reduced if government takes certain steps. For example, government has huge amounts of taxes. Government has kept taxes on fuel pretty high. Now, taxes on fuel increase inflation. For example, petrol, diesel becomes expensive. And because of petrol, diesel becoming expensive, transportation cost increases. And when transportation cost increases, well, it increases the price of everything that is being transported, right? Each and every good that is being transported, their price increases because transportation cost increases, right? And that transportation cost is increasing because petrol and diesel are expensive. So to make petrol and diesel cheap, government should reduce taxes on fuel, reduce excise duty on petrol and diesel. That would reduce inflation to a certain extent. Until that time, it would also buy RBI some time to focus on economic growth and keep its policy accommodative. Eventually, RBI will increase interest rates. Eventually, RBI will come back to inflation. But right now, RBI needs to completely focus on accommodative monetary policy. It needs to completely focus on economic growth. And inflation should be tackled by government by reducing taxes and many other steps. So the way forward is remain accommodative, don't become tight, right? Inflation should be controlled by government, and government can take n number of steps to rein in on inflation. Make sense, right? So this is the entire issue. All right. Now let's come back to the last question. In the Indian context, sustained economic growth is the right method to alleviate poverty and curtail inequality. Discuss. Well, you know, this question is also from Economic Survey, because Economic Survey actually focused on, they actually came up with a chapter in volume 1 in which they said that India should focus on poverty rather than inequality. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you see, India is actually struggling with poverty. India and many other emerging market and developing economies are struggling with poverty, right? The developed countries, USA, UK, Scandinavian countries, they are not actually suffering from poverty, or poverty is there, but not to an extent that it is there in India. Their major problem is inequality between rich and middle class, like inequality. India is actually suffering more from poverty than inequality. There is no doubt that inequality exists in India also. But India's bigger problem is poverty, right? Developed countries' bigger problem is inequality. They have solved poverty. This is their major problem. So countries like USA, countries like Norway, countries like Sweden can focus on inequality. But if you have to ask India that which category or which problem is high on your priority list, then India should say that poverty is high on our priority list. We will first tackle poverty and then worry about inequality. There is no doubt that India should worry about inequality also. But if India had to choose, and if India could only choose one, then poverty is our priority number 1. All right, makes sense? Now, to solve poverty, India should focus on growth, economic growth, right? You know, many countries in the developed West, they are saying, like many people in USA, UK, Scandinavia, they are saying that we shouldn't focus on growth, we should focus more on inequality. And these people, these economists are also prescribing this message to India also. They are saying that India should also focus on inequality because there is huge amounts of inequality in India. So India should focus more on inequality rather than growth. What we are doing, you should also do. But people should tell them that your problems are different. Norway's problems are different. Sweden's problems are different. And India's problems are different. You guys can afford to focus on inequality because you have grown quite far. You have gone very far. You have grown like anything in the past 100 years and you are there. We are here. So maybe you have grown so much that now your problem is not growth, your problem is inequality. But currently our problem is growth, because through growth, you can solve the problem of poverty. If there is no growth, India does not become rich, then how can India have the resources to take care of its poor? So to solve poverty, India needs very high levels of growth. And that is why India should focus more on growth. Yes, developed countries can focus on inequality. They can ignore growth for some times, but we can't do that. And there are proper arguments, there are proper statistical studies that are being done to prove India's argument, right? That was the domain of economic survey. This chapter also showed that. But my point on this lecture is to just explain the concept to you. All right. Well, the statistical study or what economic survey said with respect to this question, well, you'll get that in your model answer. But I'm hoping that you understood the narrative, or you understood the concept behind this question. All right. Makes sense? Chalo fir. That's it from my side, guys. I hope you liked today's lecture, and I hope it added some value for your preparation for Mains 2021. If you have any doubts, then please feel free to ask us those doubts in the comment section below, by calling us, by joining this course, in the Google Meet sessions that we are going to conduct regularly. You're free to ask us those doubts anywhere you choose. So yeah, that's it from my side, guys. I'll see you next time with more stuff. Thank you.